Hello, how are you? I hope you're having a good reading year and that you're staying safe and healthy. So a couple of days ago, Time magazine published their annual list of 100 best books of the year, and this includes a whole range of literature from novels to poetry to memoirs to essays and other nonfiction. So it's quite a wide spectrum of books, and I always really enjoy looking at it because some of these books I've not come across before, and other books are ones that I've been meaning to get to. But of course, initially I love looking at lists like this because I have that geeky thing of wanting to see how many books I've read on this list. You know, how much do I have my finger on the pulse of current literature? And the answer, really briefly, is not very well for this particular list, because I've only read 7 out of 100 of these books. So I have quite a few to go if I want to catch up and, read all the books on the list. But of course, I'm not that interested in reading all of them, though quite a lot of them I am. So I wanted to go through and give brief descriptions of all the books and just sort of so we can sort of look through the list together. And I'd be really curious to hear in the comments below how many of these books you yourself have read, which ones you'd really highly recommend of the ones that you've read, or just which books you're really interested in yourself. And of course, this is a US list of books, and I'm in the UK, so inevitably, yeah, I won't have heard some of the books because of that reason. And a lot of the books are more American-centric than some of the books that are published in the UK over the course of the year. And so I'm going to dive in and talk about all these books. And I want to show off, for ones that I have physical copies of, I want to show the physical copy of, because it's kind of interesting to see the difference between the UK covers and American covers. But also it's interesting, some of these books, like the actual names were changed and published under a different name in the UK from what it was published in the US. And I always find that really curious and interesting. And so I have to tell a little story first of and my commitment to making these book videos is that yesterday, I meant to film this video yesterday, but I didn't because I injured myself because in my library, I went to the top of my library shelf to get E for Enright, this novel, and I fell off of my library ladder, and I quite badly bruised my side, and I was worried I might have some worse injuries, so I went to A&E just to have it checked out, and yeah, it was quite a grim morning, but yeah, it's and of course now in retrospect I can sort of make a joke about it, but yeah, it was quite a traumatic thing to happen at the time. I actually fainted from the pain after it happened. But yeah, obviously I'm totally fine now, and it's just going to take a while for this bruising to heal. But yeah, and people have made the sort of joke that at a character in the novel Howard's End by E.M. Forster dies because of books topple on top of him, and I made that joke myself recently in a book haul video that I'm gonna die under a pile of books. And that almost happened yesterday, because when I fell down I pulled some books down on top of me. And if you've watched my library tour video that I made a couple years ago, you'll see just how high my bookshelves are. So I think I fell down like 5 or 6 feet, but anyway, yes, so I did finally get down this novel Actress by Anne Enright, and this is one of the novels that I've read. And it's the UK cover I think is wonderful, because if you know this photo, you know that it's Debbie Reynolds and her daughter Carrie Fisher when Carrie Fisher was young, and it just so perfectly encapsulates this difficult relationship that if you know anything about their lives, it's well documented that they had quite a difficult relationship, living this sort of showbiz lifestyle, but ultimately had a really loving and strong relationship with each other, and that's really what this novel is about. So yeah, this is the UK cover, and then this is the US cover. And the story is about a daughter reflecting on the life of her mother, who was a famous actress, and that whole sort of troubled relationship, but also sort of looking at larger issues, because the mother and daughter were Irish, and the mother sort of becomes typecast as this prototype of a Irish lass, and in films and the theater she makes a TV commercial about butter, and the line from that is, "Surely 'tis only butter," and that becomes a sort of catchphrase that she becomes known as. But how she had a very troubled life as well, and how their relationship was quite troubled. And I do have to say, I'm a huge Anne Enright fan, and I did absolutely love reading this novel. I would say, and agree with other people who've made this comment as well, that this probably isn't her strongest novel, but it's absolutely wonderful, and really meaningful, and as well as being a very entertaining story. So I'd highly recommend this novel. The Address Book by Deirdre Mask. And if you saw, I also made a video about Publisher Weekly's 10 best books of 2020, and it's another reason why I love looking at so many of these different best books of the year lists to see, which books cross over between them and how much agreement there is between the different lists. And obviously, if a book keeps appearing on so many of these lists, it really encourages me to want to read a book. And and this nonfiction book I'm really keen on. It sounds really fascinating how it looks at the names of different physical addresses and how that relates to where these names originated from, and how that relates to our ideas about our culture and race, and where sort of power lies, and who gets memorialized in our actual physical address names and who doesn't, and what that really says about the wider culture. So I think this book sounds absolutely fascinating. African American Poetry: 250 Years of Struggle and Song, edited by Kevin Yun. And I think it's so great that in the year that there's been a resurgence in the Black Lives Matter movement, that there's this new anthology from the American Library that collects together a lot of lesser known African American poets, whose poetry has sort of been lost to time, alongside some other really prominent African American writers from the Harlem Renaissance and Langston Hughes. And it's I think it's really fascinating that the editor has done such a great job collecting all of this poetry, which might have otherwise been lost to time. Afterlife by Julia Alvarez. This is a novel about a woman who's reflecting on her personal losses and people in her life who have died, and it's a kind of coming-of-age story, but she also wants to write a book about the invisible workers in the world who make our lives possible. And so it's a story about how national political concerns can have a very personal meaning in our lives, and there are no simple solutions. Agency by William Gibson. This is a science fiction novel that's actually a sequel to a novel that the author published in 2014, and it follows two future timelines, one set in the near future and one in the distant future. And it's also a sort of revision of history, or recent history, where the 2016 American elections turned out in a different way and Brexit never happened, but how a lot of society's fears still come to pass regarding climate change and pandemics and fighting over resources. So there's been a lot of dystopian fiction obviously published recently, but this sounds like a really interesting take on it, looking at time, and I have been more interested in reading science fiction recently, so I'd quite like to read this and read the author's first novel in the series. Begin Again by Eddie S. Glaude Jr., and this nonfiction book is subtitled James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own. So it's looking at the history of this great author's life and his complicated journey to understanding racism in America and his involvement in the civil rights movement. And I love James Baldwin's work, and I think he can teach us endless lessons. So I'd be really eager to read this examination of his life. Big Friendship by Aminatou So and Anne Friedman. So this is a book by two friends who have a very popular podcast called Call Your Girlfriend. boyfriend. And they argue that there are a lot of self-help books that look at how to maintain a marriage over a long period of time, but there aren't so many books that look at long-term friendships and how often these long-term friendships are just as important or more important than our long-term relationships, which is quite an interesting subject matter. The Book of Eels by Patrik Svensson, or in the UK, it was published with the title The Gospel of Eels, which is quite strange. I don't know why they thought to change the title or what was the original title. Or yeah, that's quite odd. But this is a nonfiction book looking at the history of the European eel, which has a very strange journey in the course of its life. But it's also a sort of wider look at the history of eels and the importance in culture and literature, but also the very personal story where it's sort of subtitled A Father, a Son, and the World's Most Enigmatic Fish. Yeah, I've never thought too much about eels, but I love these sort of curious books that look at a sort of curious side of the natural world, because I really love watching nature documentaries and all of that, and I've heard really great things about this, so I would be quite keen to read it. Breasts and Eggs by Mieko Kawakami. This is a novel about a woman who moves to Tokyo and wants to pursue a career as a writer, and her relationship with her sister and how her sister wants to get a breast enhancement procedure, and also about this woman's complicated relationship with her daughter who stops speaking to her. Yeah, I think this is a novel that looks at the relationships of different women and how this is a reflection on modern womanhood, and I've heard such great things about this novel. I'm very keen to read it. Brown Album, Essays on Exile and Identity by Porochista Khakpour. This is a book about what it means to be Iranian, Middle Eastern, an immigrant, a woman, and brown in America today. And I read an essay by this author that started the essay collection, The Good Immigrant USA, which was so powerful. So I'd be really keen to read more of her writing. A Burning by Megha Majumdar. This is a much talked about debut novel about a Muslim woman who witnesses a terrorist attack in India and how she posts about this on Facebook and criticizes the police, and events sort of spiral off from there to tell quite a thrilling story. Can't Even by Helen Petersen. This is a nonfiction book that looks at the question of millennials and how millennials are often categorized as entitled and lazy, but how over the past couple of decades there's obviously been economic recessions and a lot of social and political upheaval, which has really impeded the development of young people and finding their place in the world. So it sounds like it offers a different perspective on a whole generation of people who are often dismissed and talked down to. Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents by Isabel Wilkerson. This is another book that was also on that list of Publishers Weekly's 10 best books of the year, and many of you commented saying that, really urging me to read this book and highly praising it. So it's looking at the history of African Americans in America and shows how they're part of a caste system and relates that to both the caste system in Nazi Germany and in India. So yeah, I think it sounds absolutely fascinating. A Children's Bible by Lydia Millett. This is a novel about a group of children that decide to run away and make their own lives for themselves after a punishing storm destroys their vacation home. So it's another book that looks at the ingenuity and resourcefulness of young people who are often talked down to. The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin. This is an author who's won the Hugo Award multiple times, and this novel is set in modern-day New York City, but looks at it through a sort of fantasy lens where the city is under attack from someone deemed as the enemy, which is really a representation of white supremacy. Cleanness by Garth Greenwell. So this is a novel that I have the UK edition of, which I think I prefer the UK cover for this, and this was one of my most anticipated novels of the year, but I've just not got around to reading it because I think for a couple of reasons, because I've heard sort of mixed things about it, but also it seems quite similar to his debut novel What Belongs to You, in that it's also about a gay American teacher teaching English in Bulgaria. But at the same time, the way this author explores desire and relationships and sex is so innovative that I would still be keen to read it. Conditional Citizens Seasons by Leila Leilami. This is an author I've always meant to read, and this new book sounds very fascinating and seems to have a very timely message about the whole question of belonging in America. And for many immigrants, even after achieving American citizenship, are often made to still feel like outsiders. And so it's looking at that whole question of what it means to be an American and who belongs. Crooked Hallelujah by Kelly Jo Ford. This is a debut novel that looks at the stories of the lives of 4 different generations of Cherokee women and how their sense of their Native American identity changes over time and over the generations, but also how it's preserved and solidified in different ways. And I love family sagas, and so this sounds like a great new family saga that I'd be very keen to read. Culture Warlords by Talia Lavin. This is a nonfiction book by a leftist journalist who infiltrates the white supremacist sphere of the dark web by creating a number of different profiles and pretending to be a number of different people online to have interactions with different white supremacists and try to get an insight into their thought process and how they react and relate to different people on the web. Days of Distraction by Alexandra Chain. This is another debut novel about a character named Jin who works as a tech journalist and finds that she suffers a lot of racial microaggressions and struggles to progress in her career and get a pay rise. So she radically changes her life and moves across countries. So it's about her search to find a place where her identity isn't subsumed by somebody else's. Deacon King Khan by James McBride. This has been a much talked about Oprah's Book Club pick about a man who shoots a local drug dealer in the face, but that drug dealer survives and tries to exact his revenge upon Deacon King Khan. It's meant to be a very comic novel, but also one that looks at the hardened masculinity. The Dead Are Arising by Les Payne and Tamara Payne. This is a biography of Malcolm X, but actually the construction of the biography sounds like a very touching story in itself. So Les Payne spent 30 years researching this very comprehensive biography of the life of Malcolm X, but he died in 2018 before he could complete it. And so his daughter, Tamara Payne, finished this great work for him. And Malcolm X is always a figure that I've been curious about, but I don't know too much about his life, other than he was a very famous African-American Muslim minister, as well as being a human rights activist. So I'd be very fascinated to delve into this comprehensive biography. Djinn Patrol on the Purple Line by Deepa ANAPPARA. This is another debut novel about a 9-year-old boy in an unnamed city in India whose classmate goes missing, and the police refuse to investigate this and go looking for him. So this 9-year-old boy goes on a search for his classmate himself. And I've been wanting to read this novel ever since it was longlisted for the Women's Prize earlier this year. And so many people spoke about it really positively that it's one that I do really want to get to. The Dragons, the Giant, the Women by Waitu Moore. And this is yet another book that was also on that list of 10 best books of the year by Publishers Weekly. And it's a memoir about the author's family, how her ancestors fled from Liberia to America and settled as immigrants in Texas. And so it's meant to be a very personal story and very powerful, and I've heard such great things about it. Earthlings by Sayaka Murata. This is a novel I have read. It begins as a story of 2 cousins who feel that they are actually extraterrestrials, that they've come from another planet, and it follows the story of the girl who grows up to feel increasingly alienated from society and that she doesn't fit in and has to sort of change her behavior to accommodate the rules of society. So I did think this is a very interesting and quite a powerful book, and the ending is absolutely shocking to the extreme place she takes it to. But I have to admit, I think I prefer the novelist's previous book, Convenience Store Woman, over this, which explores a lot of the same themes. The End of White Politics by Zerlina Maxwell. This is a nonfiction book looking at the author's own experiences working within Democratic political campaigns in America in recent years, and how she notices and identifies a lot of divisions within the political left in America in regards to racism, and suggests methods of how we can overcome these divides. Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake, and this is a nonfiction book that's subtitled How Fungi Make Our Worlds, Change Our Minds, and Shape Our Futures. So it's looking at the whole strange lives of mushrooms and how they can have these odd interconnected relationships with each other and share nutrients and have this whole life that we never guessed at, just sort of like walking over them in the forest. And I never would have thought I would be that interested in mushrooms, but this does sound really fascinating. Enter the Aardvark by Jessica Anthony. This is a novel about a young male Republican congressman who unexpectedly receives in the mail a giant stuffed aardvark. So it's meant to be quite a comic story, looking at the reasons why he received this unexpected gift, and also connecting his story with the 19th century men in England who hunted and stuffed these aardvarks. And so it sounds like quite a fascinating perspective on male power and rage and love. Followers by Megan Angelo. This is a novel about a jaded blogger named Orla who in the year 2015 decides to turn her flatmate into a social media celebrity, and how there are many unexpected consequences of that, going into this dystopian future where celebrity has a strange place in the American landscape. And I just think that sounds like such a fascinating way of looking at the strange monster of social media. A Girl is a Body of Water by Jennifer Natsambuga Makumbi. Although interestingly, in the UK, her novel was published under the title The First Woman. So I've read this author's novel Chintu, which was such a fascinating story, had multiple strands to it, but this sounds like a much more sort of focused novel about a 12-year-old girl in Uganda who is trying to grow and become her own person, and how she's very influenced by the different women in her life who alternately influence and inspire her, but also in some ways inhibit her growth and coming into herself. And so I'm so eager to get to reading this. The Glass Hotel by Emily St. John Mandel, and this is one of those novels that sounds quite difficult to summarize. I believe the story is about a woman that disappears from a container ship, but also a massive Ponzi scheme that implodes. But it's meant to be about money, beauty, crime, and moral compromise. So I have read this author's novel Station 11, which I loved, but I have heard quite mixed things about this, so I'm still uncertain about if this is a novel I do want to read. Golden Gates by Connor Doherty. This is a nonfiction book that looks at the issue of homelessness in the city of San Francisco and asks how a city which is so prosperous in many ways can have such a massive problem with homelessness, which has been occurring for decades. And I remember when I went to San Francisco and visited there, I witnessed that firsthand. And it's such a striking issue. So this sounds really interesting. Having and Being Had by Eula Biss. So this book starts when the author receives an IKEA catalog, and she looks at the messages in that catalog and what it says about us as a consumerist society, and how the store is really selling furniture for the apocalypse. It's looking at these different ideas about capitalism and what it says about class and privilege in modern day society. Hidden Valley Road by Robert Kolker. This is a nonfiction book that looks at the history and story of a family called the Galvins, who in the 1960s seemed like the ideal American family, but on the inside they were plagued by violence and mental health issues that really tore their family apart. So I think it's looking at the larger question of what is the ideal American family. His Wife Only by Peace Adzo Medi. This is a novel about a poor young seamstress in Ghana who marries a very wealthy man, and how this creates an uneven relationship between them, but also for the wife's mother. And so it's a novel about extended family, and it's dubbed a sort of Cinderella story for the year 2020. Hitler by Volker Ulrich. This is the second part in a massive two-part biography on the life of Adolf Hitler, whose life is obviously been covered very comprehensively over time, but this is meant to be a very authoritative biography. And this second part looks specifically of the years during World War II and how lots of aspects of Hitler's personality, which helped him rise to power, also helped orchestrate his downfall. Hitting a Straight Lick with a Crooked Stick by Zora Neale Hurston, which is the most fantastic title. And this is a new collection of short stories by an author who obviously died a long time ago, but the collection brings together some stories which are sort of so-called lost stories that have been kind of lost over time, as well as some of her more well-known short fiction. And many of the stories are set in Harlem in the 1920s. And yeah, this has a beautiful cover, an amazing title, and is an author that I've wanted to read more of. Homeland Elegies by Akhtar. This is yet another novel that was also on that Publishers Weekly 10 Best Books of the Year list, and is a novel which is meant to blend sort of memoir and fiction to tell a story that is partly about the author's life, or it may not be, and his father's involvement with Donald Trump. Hood Feminism by Miki Kendall. This is a nonfiction book which asks mainstream feminism to examine its own privilege and whiteness, and it's subtitled Notes from the Women That a Movement Forgot. How to Pronounce Knife by Suvakam Thamamvosa. This is a collection of short stories that look at the struggles and lives of Laotian immigrants in Toronto, and I believe this book just won the Giller Prize in Canada. I Don't Want to Die Poor by Michael Arsenault. This is a collection of essays looking at the question of finances, particularly student debt, but also the author's experiences with dating and family life, and how as a black gay man from a working class family, he's often meant to feel not only uncomfortable but also unsafe. I Hold a Wolf by the Ears by Laura Vandenberg. This is a collection of short stories about women who are facing many unsettling dilemmas, and the stories are meant to be very haunting but also contemplative. If I Had Your Face by Frances Cha. This is another debut novel that looks at the lives of 4 different women in modern-day Seoul who are dealing with issues to do with finance and their careers and their families, and who dream of escaping these troubles through different methods. So it's looking at repressive misogyny and class tensions. Interior Chinatown by Charles Yu. I talked about this novel recently in a book haul video I did, and the story focuses on a man that works as an extra in a detective crime series drama, and how he's often stereotyped as the generic Asian man. That's the role he's often meant to play in this series. And so it's looking at these like racial stereotypes, but I think it's meant to be quite a comic novel, sort of looking at these issues, and also to do with assimilation and popular culture in modern day America. Intimations by Zadie Smith. This is a new collection of essays that the author wrote actually this year over the course of the pandemic, examining how the pandemic amplified social divides both in her own personal life and in the country as a whole. Is Rape a Crime by Michelle Boldler. This is subtitled A Memoir, an Investigation, and a Manifesto. So it's looking at the author's own experiences, how when she was 24 years old, her apartment was broken into by 2 men who raped her, and she dutifully filled out a crime report about this, but the investigation never led to anything. And so she looks at the shocking fact that only 2% of reported rape cases in America results in incarceration and conviction, which is an absolutely shocking, horrible fact. So this book is looking at an extremely important and big issue. Jack by Marilynne Robinson. This is a novel I've been really wanting to read, but it's the 4th book in Marilynne Robinson's Gilead books, and I've only read 2 of the books. I read Gilead and I read Lila, and I absolutely loved Lila, but I need to go back and I want to reread Gilead and Home and maybe Lila before going to this book. So the story follows Jack, who, if you've read Gilead, you know this is the son of a Presbyterian minister who sort of disgraced his father and left home, and it's following his story. Just Us, An American Conversation by Claudia Rankine. This is a book I bought recently when it was Bookshop Day here in the UK, and that I'm really eager to read, and is a series of discussions and conversations that the author had with various people, some who are friends and well known to her, and others who are strangers with very different opinions, to sort of look at divides in American society today. Kim Ji-yeon, born 1982 by Cho Nam-ju. This is a book which looks at the life of an ordinary woman in South Korea and her experiences with gender inequality, and how this is sadly representative of the lives of many women in South Korea. Leave the World Behind by Rumaan Alam, and this is the UK cover for the novel. So this is a story about two families who are trapped together in a house that when the city experiences a blackout and they have no connection to the internet or people on the outside, and there's a feeling that this is the coming of an apocalypse. So it's a very different kind of dystopian story. Let's Never Talk About This Again by Sarah Faith Alterman. This is a memoir that is quite a curious story about the author looking at her father's experiences having a pornographic career, but how she never really realized this for a lot of her life, because he often seemed to be quite a prudish individual and he never shared these details with her. But then as he starts experiencing signs of Alzheimer's, some of these facts about his life sort of come out. So this sounds like quite an uncomfortable story. Luster by Raven Leilani. This is a novel that has been much talked about, and which came out in the US a little while ago, but hasn't been published in the UK yet. But I've been sent this advanced copy, and so it's the story of a black 23-year-old young woman trying to navigate her way in the world, and through complicated relationships. She has a very complicated affair with a married man, which grows very messy. The Lion Life of Adults by Elena Ferrante. This is the first novel that this author has published outside of her Neapolitan quartet since its conclusion. And it's the story of a 12-year-old girl who overhears a conversation between her parents where her father calls her ugly. So it's about the tension between her and her parents and how she tries to seek out to have a relationship with her aunt and a closer relationship with her. And I've never read any Elena Ferrante, and I know that that's awful and I should really catch up, but I wonder if maybe I should read this novel before then going to the famous Neapolitan quartet. Memorial by Brian Washington, and this is another novel that's already been published in America but hasn't been published in the UK yet. So I have this advanced copy of the novel, which I'm really eager to get to, because I read some of the stories in the author's debut short story collection, Lot, and I absolutely loved them. And so the premise of this novel is about a black daycare teacher who is having a relationship with a Japanese-American chef, and they live together in Houston, but how complications arise when they have different encounters with each other's families. And so I'm very eager to read this novel and finish reading the stories in Lot. Memorial Drive by Natasha Trethewey. This sounds like a harrowing memoir by a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet who is reflecting on the death and murder of her mother. When the author was only 19 years old, her mother was brutally murdered by her former stepfather. It sounds a very tense story, but also looks at larger issues to do with racism in America. Migrations by Charlotte McConaughey. This is a novel where many of the animals in the world are becoming extinct, and the story follows a woman who becomes obsessed with the final flock of Arctic terns that are making their final migration. Minor Feelings by Kathy Park Hahn. This is a collection of essays which has the subtitle An Asian American Reckoning. So the author, who's also a poet, examines her own personal experiences and her wider observations about American culture, about racial divisions within the country and the corrosive effects that this has upon our emotions. The Mirror and the Light by Hilary Mantel, and of course I have the UK edition as well, and this is one of the books that I've read, and so even though I've only read 7 out of these 100 books, I read one of the ones that's 878 pages pages long. So this is, of course, the final part in Hilary Mantel's trilogy about Thomas Cromwell, which I've read in its entirety this year, and is such an epic journey. And it is so moving how this conclusion shows the end of Thomas Cromwell's life and his political career under Henry VIII, and how that comes to such a tragic conclusion. My Autobiography of Carson McCullers by Jen Shapland. So this is about the author's experiences in academia, how she uncovered a series of letters by the author Carson McCullers between McCullers and her female lover, and how this inspired Jen Shapland to come out herself and live as a lesbian. So yeah, that sounds like such an inspiring, fascinating story. Nerve by Ava Holland. The author's worst fear in her life was to lose her mother, and in 2015 her mother actually did die. And in the midst of her grief, she started wondering about the forces which drive the worst fears in her life, and she interviewed a number of scientists about this issue, and this book is as a result of that research. So it's subtitled Adventures in the Science of Fear. The Night Watchman by Louise Erdrich. This is a novel about a piece of legislation which sought to effectively end the way of life for a particular Chippewa tribe, and about the lives of the people involved in that. And I think this is modeled after Louise Erdrich's own grandfather's experience. So I've read this author before, and I've really enjoyed her writing and been wanting to read more of her books. So yeah, I'm quite keen to read this. Nights When Nothing Happens by Simon Han. This is a debut novel about a family of 4 that arrive in Texas at different moments in time and have very different states of mind, and their experiences trying to integrate into their community. Notes on a Silencing by Lacey Crawford. This is a memoir where the author describes her experiences going to an elite boarding school in New Hampshire, and in the year 1991 she experienced a sexual assault there, and so she discusses her experiences with that, but also how she was warned that if she reported this criminal assault, she would be expelled from the school. So this is a book that adds another voice to the Me Too movement. Obit by Victoria Chain. This is a collection of poetry that the author was inspired to write after her mother died, and her experiences feeling like the world was moving on and she couldn't grieve in the way that she wanted to, and how she was asked to write an obituary for her mother. So these poems are sort of processing her feelings about that. Oligarchy by Scarlett Thomas. This is a novel about a girl whose father is a Russian oligarch, and she moves to an all-girls boarding school in the English countryside, and her experiences there trying to learn how to fit in with the other girls at this school, and how one of her friends goes missing. And so it's sort of the story of that disappearance and her own experiences at that school. One Mighty and Irresistible Tide by Jia Lin Yang. This is a nonfiction work by a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who's writing about an era in early 20th century America when legislation was enacted to stop immigrants coming from many other countries, and how a group of locally elected officials and activists worked on an act to overcome this, to allow more immigrants to come back into the country. One to Watch by Kate Stamen London. This is a novel about a plus-size style blogger who's making observations about a lack of diversity in body sizes in popular mainstream media, and how that's slowly changing. The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. This is a novel about 4 members of the Blackfeet Nation tribe who are haunted by an incident once where they went hunting and killed a pregnant elk, and how that eventually that pregnant elk comes to take its revenge. Open Book by Jessica Simpson. Now, I don't often read celebrity memoirs or have much interest in them, but this memoir is meant to go in very deep and be very honest account of the author's relationships and her experiences with celebrity, and it's meant to say something larger chapter about the dream of celebrity life in America. Party of Two by Jasmine Guillory. This is a rom-com romance novel about a black lawyer and a white politician who have a chance encounter that develops into a much larger and meaningful relationship. The Pink Line, Journeys Across the World's Queer Frontiers by Mark Gevisser, who's an author and journalist that traveled around the world interviewing a number of different queer people about their experiences and their activisms, and looking at how the world's understanding of LGBT rights and experiences has really changed over the past 20 years. Piranesi by Susanna Clark. This is a novel about an individual who lives in a giant house where there are many antiquities and curiosity that he endlessly categorizes and writes about in notebooks, and he has no contact with anyone else except for one other individual that occasionally visits him, and he gradually discovers that there are more sinister things and reasons for this household being the way it is, and it's about the question of whether he's more happy in living in his ignorance about why he's there and why things are the way that they are, or to really discover and find out why this has occurred. Of course, I loved this author's novel Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, and I'm so excited to get to this. I feel like this is going to be a wonderful indulgence to read over the winter months. Post-Colonial Love Poem by Natalie Diaz. This book was a finalist for the National Book Awards, and it's a poetry collection exploring how ideas of colonialism and racism really reside within the individual that experienced them. The Purpose of Power by Alicia Garza. This is a memoir nonfiction book by one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, and so she traces the history of this movement and its formation, and also her personal experiences which have informed her activism. Reaganland by Rick Perlstein. This is an author that looks at the history of conservative America in modern times, and this book obviously focuses on the 1970s and the rise of Ronald Reagan and how really that laid the groundwork for the rise of Trump. Recollections of My Non-Existence by Rebecca Solnit. So this is an author that has established herself as one of the leading feminist voices in American society, writing many essays about that experience. And this is her first memoir reflecting on her own experiences and how this has informed her opinions and ideas about feminism. Run Me to Earth by Paul Yoon. This is a novel about three teenagers in war-torn Laos in the 1960s and how they helped a doctor during that time, and how those experiences and the trauma they experienced during that time informed their later lives. A Saint from Texas by Edmund White. I read this novel and absolutely loved it. It's the story of twin sisters that are growing up in Texas in the 1950s, and they're identical, but their personalities are completely opposite from each other, and it follows their very different lives as they travel to different parts of the globe. And it is such a fascinating contrast and such a pleasurable and enjoyable story. Sex and Vanity by Kevin Kwan. This is the author's first novel outside of his best-selling Crazy Rich Asians trilogy, and the story follows a woman who's torn between two different suitors, and the story is meant to be modeled on E.M.F. Forster's novel A Room with a View. She Come By It Natural by Sarah Smarsh. This is subtitled Dolly Parton and the Women Who Lived Her Songs. So it's a collection of essays about Dolly Parton's life, and also the many kinds of women that she sang about and who the author grew up living around and who knew very intimately. Shuggie Bain by Douglas Stewart. This is a debut novel which has become such a sensation this year. So this is the US cover, but this is the UK cover. I sort of prefer the UK cover, but I know that the US cover is more expressive of what the story is actually about, which is a boy growing up in Glasgow in the 1980s in a working class community and his experiences with his alcoholic mother. And it's really more about the story of the mother, but also about how the boy doesn't really fit in with the community and the community's expectations about masculinity. And I just loved this novel so much. The Splendid and the Vile by Eric Larson. This is a chronicle of London's experience experiences during World War II and the onslaught of the Blitz, and the experiences of Winston Churchill and his family and his advisors, and the challenges that they faced. The Sword and the Shield by Peniel E. Joseph. This is a book that looks at the contrasting lives and experiences of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. and their involvement in the civil rights movement, and how they effectively wanted the same thing, but they obviously had very different approaches for making it happen. To Be a Man by Nicole Cross. This is a collection of short stories that look at issues to do with gender, power, and aging. And this is an author that I've read before, and I've been really wanting to read more of her work. Tokyo Uno Station by Yu Miri. This is a book that looks at the life of a migrant worker that is homeless and lives amongst other homeless people in a park that's right next to a very busy station in Tokyo, and how the lives of those commuters contrast very sharply with the lives of the homeless people in this community in the park. Topics of Conversation by Miranda Popke. This is a novel about a young woman who has a series of discussions over many years with a range of women who want to be subjugated by men. So it's a different look at womanhood. The Undocumented Americans by Carla Cornejo Villavicencio. This is a book where the author looks at the stories of a number of different undocumented Americans and what this says about the larger issue. Unfree Speech by Joshua Wan. This is about how a teenager grew into becoming a very vocal political activist involved in fighting against various anti-democracy movements. Vanguard by Martha S. Jones. This is a nonfiction book looking at the lives of a Black woman's involvement in the suffragette movement. The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett, and I loved reading this novel, which actually, now that I think about it, has interesting parallels with Edmund White's novel in that it's also a story about sisters who go on to lead very different lives from each other. They come from the same small community that is mostly composed of light-skinned African Americans, and they themselves are very light-skinned, so can sort of pass as white, and one sister grows up passing as white and presenting herself as white to the world, and the other sister goes on to lead a very different life and marries a Black man and has a very dark-skinned daughter. And following their stories is so harrowing and emotional and moving and inspiring, and she gets a lot of the humor of their lives as well, and I think it's just such a wonderful story. Vesper Flights by Helen MacDonald. I loved this author's book, H is for Hawk, and this is a collection of essays looking at our state of constant grief as we're experiencing the loss of a lot of wildlife amidst climate change. Wandering in Strange Lands by Morgan Jerkins. This is a book which explores the author's family history, which is really rooted in American slavery in the South, and how her family tried to find new opportunities by migrating to other places. And so she explores this sort of personal history and how it is a reflection on America's history as a whole. Want by Lynn Steger Strawn. This is a novel about a woman in her 30s who grew up very privileged and wealthy, but now finds herself on the verge of bankruptcy with a young family to take care of. So it's about her struggles balancing ambition with reality. We Ride Upon Sticks by Quan Berry. This sounds like quite a funny novel, which is set in a high school in the year 1989 in a small, quaint Massachusetts community, and how a field hockey team at a high school in this community will do anything it takes to win the championships. And this local community has ties with the witch trials from hundreds of years past, and how this field hockey team consults the dark magic and occult in order to try to win this championship. Weather by Jenny Ophel. I loved this short, impactful novel whose narrator, Lizzie, becomes consumed with the climate crisis, and it shows snapshots of her life, sort of having encounters with different people in relation to that, but also about her experiences with her brother who suffers from addiction and various different issues. And so this is the US cover, but this is the UK cover. And I think I prefer the US cover, but let me know what you think. Where the Wild Ladies Are by Oku Matsuda. This is a collection of short stories which are retellings of traditional Japanese ghost stories with a kind of feminist twist, and a lot of them dip into the supernatural. This sounds so intriguing. Why We Swim by Bonnie Sue. This looks at the author's own experiences and lifelong passion for swimming, and she connects that with larger ideas about why we as humankind love to swim and dive into the water. Wow, No Thank You by Samantha Irby. This is a collection of essays which are quite humorous in tone, looking at modern life, everything from our addiction to using our phones to the difficulty of making new friends. You Never Forget Your First by Alexis Coe. This is a biography of George Washington, and it's the first biography written of the America's first president for a very long time. So it gives quite a different perspective and twist on his life, and examines how, he had lots of ambitions which were very good in intention, but then how he could occasionally be a tyrant. And I've heard such great things about this. I'd be really curious to read it. 150 Glimpses of the Beatles by Craig Brown. This is a book which looks at the history of the Beatles through these different snapshots of experiences in their lives and their the formation of their band and the experiences of their band, to give a sort of different portrait of the lives of the Beatles, who have obviously been written about so many times before. So those are the 100 books on Time's list. I'll put a link below so you can see all of the books all grouped together if you want to. This video has become quite an epic journey. Thank you for watching all the way through if you've stuck through to the very end. But like I said, let me know in the comments below if you've read any of these books and would really highly recommend them, especially ones that I've not read. But also let me know about any ones that you're interested in now, now that they've been cited on this list. So thank you for watching. Happy reading, everyone. I'll speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.